Today I'm going to be taking a look at the opening scenes from the Terminator, in particular the character introductions. Now I did this a little bit ago with Unbreakable, and I wanted to do it for the Terminator because it has three characters to talk about, those being the Terminator, the titular Terminator, Kyle Reese, and Sarah Connor. And I think what's interesting here, compared to what I did when I talked about the Unbreakable opening, is that with Unbreakable I talked so much about cinematography. That was like the main focus of that entire piece. My entire thoughts on that set of introductions was all about how it was captured on the camera. I feel like with the Terminator it's a little bit different because, well, obviously cinematography is a factor and it definitely plays a role. It's much more about how it's written and the choices that are made in the scenes. And I think one of the big things about the Terminator, especially with two of these characters, is comparing the two introductions. Because Kyle Reese and the Terminator both have very similar entrances in some ways, but they're vastly different in others. And I think that's where a lot of the enrichment comes from these two scenes. The Terminator, of course, arrives at the top of the hills up at the observatory. I think it's the Griffin Observatory, if I'm remembering the name of that place correctly. And he arrives when there's very little people around. Of course, there's one guy operating a machine, a big, I think he's lifting up the dumpster. And the Terminator arrives, it scares this guy off, and the Terminator is otherwise on his own. And he does his classic Arnold's performance here where he rises up slowly. It's kind of like a robot turning on where his body rises up first and then his head lifts up second. And we get the close-up of his eyes moving from side to side. And then he walks towards the edge of this car park or whatever it is up at the building and looks down over Los Angeles with his butt out, right? He's naked, he's completely naked. And I think just this first part of it, because I'm going to also include the next scene here where he gets his clothes from the punks. He's very confident, obviously, right? He shows very little concern for anything. He's very robotic, obviously, in his performance, which makes sense since he's literally a robot. But it's all very elegant, it's all very steadily paced, both in the camera work and in the music. One of the things that really stuck out to me watching these scenes through and through again and again is that when Kyle's arrival happens, there's a lot of noise that comes with it. In particular, himself, like his breathing, he's obviously in pain, he's grunting, there's a lot of those things going on. With the Terminator, it's dead silence. Like, obviously, yes, the lightning effects and all that, like when he's arriving is quite loud, but once he actually arrives, the only sound we get is the music. And the music itself, again, is very rhythmic. It's very bum, 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 bum. Bum, 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 bum. There's a pulse to it. It's very steady. And the camera work kind of also adds in with that, where it's these, very steady shots. There's the one slow sort of track into them. And it's all very kind of on rails. It's all very machine-like. The fact that the scene even starts with like a modern day 1984 machine, this truck, right, that's got a big robotic arm, is kind of not as advanced as it could get, but there's clearly a parallel that they're using there. The film does it again later on when Kyle thinks about the future because he's fallen asleep next to all this building site with all the tractors and bulldozers and things like that. So there's a lot of that, I think, starting here too with this truck leading into the introduction of the Terminator. And of course, the end of this scene where Arnold is looking down over the city, I mean, that kind of speaks for itself almost. Like, the city's not prepared for this thing, this Terminator from the future that's going to raise hell. The city is not prepared for it, and he's looking down over it because he's separate from it. And that's one of the other key differences with Kyle Reese that I love to point out here, is that Kyle arrives in the middle of the city. He literally arrives in an alleyway in the middle of LA. He's amongst the people because he's one of them, effectively. Whereas the Terminator arrives separately at a different location, one that's a strong vantage point, one that is maybe even also a sign that the Terminator machines, that Skynet in the future was able to pick a location that was optimal, some place that wouldn't attract a lot of attention, some place that would be a good tactical choice. Whereas it maybe implies that the human beings who have kind of co-opted the machine's technology to send Kyle back maybe didn't have an exact science down. Maybe we're struggling, and the fact that Kyle even seems to arrive a little bit mid-air when he does arrive also suggests that the humans didn't quite fully have a handle on the technology of sending someone back in time. The Terminator's entrance is perfect, and some of that is just because he's a machine that can withstand the journey, but some of it also seems to be just how much finesse they had in controlling where they sent him versus Kyle, who kind of arrives midair in an alleyway and falls to the ground in great pain in a location that isn't that great because it is in the middle of the city. Arguably, they chose that as well because they thought, oh, maybe he'll get to Sarah Connor first, but it definitely suggests to me that they weren't as experienced in using it and that they were struggling to get a handle on it when they sent him back. And that's just one of the little things I like about these opening scenes is that they're rich enough that you can maybe start thinking a little bit about the context behind them, what it maybe suggests about where they came from. The other things that I would point out here with the Terminator's entrance is that when he does move on to his next scene and he encounters the punks that he gets his clothes from, obviously there's some simple little things here where he speaks in very short sentences, but more importantly, he's intimidating. He forces them to give clothes through violence, and he's very confident. Everything about him is very confident. There's not a hint of shame. He didn't care that he was walking around naked. He's only getting clothes because he knows he needs to do it to blend in. It's a tactical choice that is being made. He doesn't care that he schlongs around for everyone to see. So these punks make fun of him for a second, but quite quickly obviously get scared, and the Terminator gets what he wants. That's kind of that scene. And I don't really have much more to say about it, although I will point out that Bill Paxton is one of the punks, as is Brian Thompson, who was like a guest star on a bunch of TV shows, most notably on 2 episodes of the hit television show Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And once again, this contrasts a lot with Kyle's entrance, because Kyle's entrance, when he does interact with people, it's not this confident, intimidating way. He's shaking. Even though he does hold up a gun against a police officer and demands information, it's not like the Terminator where it's this cold, soulless approach. He is clearly feeling the adrenaline of what he's doing. He's feeling the adrenaline, even though we know he's doing it for good reasons, or at least we learn that he's doing it for good reasons as the movie progresses and we learn more about him. In the scene, you can tell that it's taking a toll on him, and that's one of the big differences between them. But what I do think is interesting, though, is that both the Terminator and Kyle both arrive at night. It feels cold, it feels like they're coming from a darker world, whereas when we get to Sarah's introduction, she's introduced in daylight. She's introduced when everything's happy and sunny, and it's really making a point of saying that she is not from the same world that these other 2 characters are coming from. So sticking with Kyle, he struggles to stand up. He's in pain. Compare it to that opening scene with the Terminator, where he gets that close-up on his eyes as he just observes, as he just looks around, and he's just looking at his surroundings. Kyle, as he stands up, looking down the alleyway and holding his stomach, and he's in pain. He has to steal. He has to scavenge. And I think that's the big thing that I really want to point out with Kyle. Once he starts to run away a little bit, and notably the camera work is a lot more frantic, it's not these steady like tracking shots and whatever, it's this like really, again, full of adrenaline, running down the alleyway from the police officer. But once he gets into the stores, into the department store, and he's sneaking around and he's stealing his clothes, what really stuck out to me about that, especially knowing the rest of the film and knowing the flashbacks we get, it is hinted a little bit in the very opening scene where we get a quick vision of the future before the big text crawl. This very much emulates what his life is like in the future. He's ducking and diving and staying out of the line of sight as these like 2 or 3 police officers are walking around the store with torches, with flashlights, and they're scanning and they're looking for him. This is very similar to the Terminators, the big Terminators in the future, going around with their searchlights and trying to find the resistance. And Kyle has spent his life, at least his adult life, if not most of his life in general, hiding from these Terminators and hiding in the dark because his life depended on it. And I think it's very interesting that while he struggles when he first arrives because he's in pain, because he's a human being and he's feeling all these things, once he has a little bit of time to recoup, he actually is very good at this. Like, once he's able to sneak around like he does in the future, once he's putting into practice what he's been doing in that future life, he's actually really good at this. And he does sneak around the police effortlessly. He does steal, he does the Nike shoe product placement and he gets a jacket. All of this sneaking around is very reminiscent and kind of is like a really low budget way to show what Kyle's life in the future is like. Because this is what his life in the future is like. It is this. It is running in the dark, ducking and diving, and hiding from Terminators. and here the police are effectively filling in for the Terminators. Of course, I kind of glossed over the little bit where he actually asked what the year is, and him saying what year is it, and the guy being confused. You know, it's an important moment to sell to the audience what's going on, to reiterate that, okay, these two characters are from the future. We can kind of deduce that between that line and obviously what the opening told us. But it's all the other things I really want to focus on. It's all of these visual clues. It's the clues of like how Kyle acts in the scene, how he's able to achieve what he does. And everything he gets, he does by scavenging. He does by sneaking around and stealing what he needs to survive. And in this case, it's clothes and then eventually the shotgun from the police car. Contrast that to the Terminator, where he just walks up and demands and takes what he needs, and that's it. I feel like it's important to like give those scenes together because they feel like collectively they are the introduction to the characters. I think because you get Kyle second, it really makes the Terminator look a lot more intimidating and a lot more robotic in comparison. Yes, we can kind of get that from his scene on his own, but once you see what an actual human being is going through by doing this journey, by coming back through time, and how much of a struggle it is for him because everything's much harder, it sort of emphasizes just how imposing the Terminator was in that opening scene before him. And of course, the end of Kyle Reese's introduction, when he finally gets out onto the street, he's got the shotgun on his coat. The scene does a pretty simple but effective transition where he goes to the phone book to find Sarah Connor's name, and it cuts from her name on the book to her introduction scene. So there's a nice like handoff between the two previous introduction scenes and then her introduction scene. And like I said earlier, she is introduced in broad daylight. Her wind is blowing in the hair because she's on a moped. She's wearing like baby blue and baby pink. Even as soon as she gets off the bike and she has a little joke with the mascot out in front of the restaurant she works at, and it's like this, you know, big fat guy holding two burgers, and she says, "Guard it for me, Big Buns." The reason why I'm pointing this out is two reasons. One, the fact that she's making a silly little joke is a very big contrast to how like desperate the other two scenes were. Like the Terminator was a horror movie scene, and then Kyle felt like he was fighting for his life and like he was really desperate the entire time. She does not really have that much of a care in the world. Her biggest concern is getting to work on time. She's a little bit late, and that is her problem right now. It feels so minuscule compared to the other two characters and the way they were introduced. But also just all the colors that are here. I mentioned that she's wearing these sort of lighter, colorful items, but even the burger buns, which have got, you know, fake ketchup and mustard, and I think some maybe lettuce for some green. There's like these bright, vivid colors, which really contrast with the dark, gritty, and steel and metallic colors that we got a lot of in the Terminator and Kyle Reese scenes. Visually, there's such a big difference between her introduction and then the two characters that preceded her, which really contrasts this idea that she is not from the same world that those two characters are. She is from the world that we recognize more so. She's from the normal world. And that's why it's important that she has a normal, everyday problem. She's late for work. In fact, as the movie goes on, we find out her biggest concern in life right now is that she might not have a date for Saturday night. And that's part of the movie's like big arc for her, is like she goes from not having a care in the world to having this other world burst into her world, and all of a sudden she has to learn to defend herself and care about defending herself. I'm cheating a little bit here because it actually cuts to another little scene of the Terminator. But much like the other two characters, I'm going to include her first two scenes because the second scene is still at the restaurant and it's still clearly established in some of her characteristics. And it's basically a scene where she's coming out and delivering food to a table, and she's a bit overwhelmed. All the customers are complaining that she's not got the right order. She's trying to figure out whose is whose, and she's really struggling. She feels a little bit, you know, frazzled by it. And again, it's not really in the grand scheme of things when we're talking about post-apocalyptic wars against machines. Not getting the right lunch order doesn't feel like that big of a deal, but this is the concerns that she's dealing with. I think more important though is the little moment where there's this kid who puts some ice cream in her pocket, and she just kind of like has this look on her face, and then like her co-worker cracks a little joke about it, a little on the nose joke might I add about the future. The important thing here though is that she's not even willing to stick up for herself against a child putting ice cream in her coat. Now obviously she might think it's inappropriate to really say anything, right? There's a lot of reasons why you can say this isn't a flaw necessarily. But given that what we learn about her in the future scenes, when the Terminator first comes after her and she just sits there with like a deer in the headlights, frozen with fear, this idea that she can't even stick up for herself even a little bit against a child at her workplace is kind of that first indication that she doesn't have this will to fight for herself, that she does just like let people walk over her. And that's kind of hinted at here in this very, well, not first scene, technically it's her second scene, but I think those first two scenes together really are the introduction for Sarah Connor. Her introduction is a lot more challenging, and I think this is why it's the third one in the movie. I think this is why you don't start with her. I think you start with the Terminator and Kyle Reese because they have all the mystique. They're the interesting characters to begin with because, oh, this guy's probably a robot and this other guy's from the future, and they're immediately introduced into violence and danger and trying to accomplish very serious things, right? There's a lot of mystique, and we know that we're going to learn more about this future that we've been teased in the opening between, from those characters. That's where that's going to come from. With Sarah Connor, it's a little bit tougher in terms of making it exciting because she is just a normal person going to her job. So the excitement's never going to come from her in the same way that it does with the first two. So I think you start with the first two so that you get people hooked, right? You bring them in with the excitement, and then you give them Sarah Connor because one, you give us the nice, innocent character that we're going to like root for and be scared that something might happen to. You make her likable, and you also give us kind of that contrast with those first two. One of the things that makes her feel like a normal, everyday human being is that she's the only one of the three characters who doesn't start the movie with her goal. Like, her goal to survive, obviously, doesn't really become clear to her. She's not aware that she has to do that until the Terminator tries to kill her. Whereas Kyle and the Terminator both arrive with their purpose. They're both already gunning for something. Terminator's trying to find Sarah to kill her. Kyle's trying to find her to protect her. Ultimately, the arc of the film, in many ways, is her going from passive to being proactive by the end. If you want to strip the Terminator down, that is the central arc of Sarah Connor. There's more to it than that, of course. There's an empowerment element to it. There's been a willing to fight for yourself and all that stuff. But if you want to really strip it down to the complete bare minimum, it's passive to proactive. That's what makes the change exciting, because by the time you get to the end of the movie and you think back to this Sarah Connor riding on her moped with the wind blowing in the hair, you see how far she's come. I think the Terminator has a really great set of opening scenes. Of course, I didn't really talk about the actual opening scene, which is technically this little quick snippet of the future before the information pops up. Obviously, that's important. Obviously, that's your little taste of, hey, all this exciting stuff's going to happen. But for me, there's a lot more nuance in how the characters are introduced. There you go. That's my thoughts, my analysis of the opening character introductions of the Terminator. This was something I wanted to get back to and do a little bit more of. Hopefully people enjoyed this one. And do let me know if you did, because it'll encourage me to do a bit more things like this. If not character introduction scenes, then maybe take some other scenes from other parts of the movie or other movies and kind of really dig into them and sort of look at what makes them work and what the script's doing and so on and so on. If you want to support the channel and videos like this, as well as all the podcasts, you can do that over at patreon.com/MailFuzzTV or via YouTube membership if that's more your thing. But thank you very much for joining me. I do appreciate it, and I'll see you next time.